This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by Orbis.
Christy Abizaid just completed an assignment as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. She began her career as an analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and she served as a policy official at both the National Security Council and the Department of Defense. She joins us today to share her thoughts on a variety of issues related to intelligence. We will be right back with that discussion after a quick break. I'm Michael Morrell, and this is Intelligence Matters. Rooted in the U.S. intelligence and special operations communities, Orbis is investing today in the people and capabilities needed to deliver national security tomorrow. Data is everywhere and easy to acquire. The intelligence mission requires new thinking and new approaches to make the most of that data. That's where Orbis is making a difference. Unburdened by legacy business models, we're building the intelligence business of the future. We provide highly empowered, creative teams that deliver impactful outcomes and asymmetric capabilities for our clients worldwide. If you're looking for a strategic ally with experience navigating the complexities of the modern information environment, or if you envision contributing your unique experiences to elevate global security, then we're ready for you. Connect with us at intelligencematters@orbis.com. That's intelligencematters@orbis.com. Uncover the extraordinary with Orbis. Christy, welcome. Welcome to Intelligence Matters.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here.
You're welcome. You've been on the podcast before. You were the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, and you came on our show and you talked about the work of the center and how important it is. And we talked about the terrorism landscape. So it's, that was a fantastic conversation, and it's great to have you back.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking me to come back, especially after that last conversation. I wasn't really sure. No, it's really neat to be able to be here again.
So most people, Christy, will probably think that we're going to spend this 40 minutes, this episode of the podcast, talking about terrorism again, but we're not going to do that. You and I have talked about this. What I really want to do is take advantage of your entire career to talk about the lessons you've learned about the intelligence profession, about intelligence analysis, and about leadership of intelligence enterprises, which probably applies not only to intelligence enterprises, but to any enterprise, right, at the end of the day. So I'm really looking forward to that because I think you've got some great insights to share and some important insights to share. So with all of that, let's jump into your career first to kind of set a basis and give people a sense of, what your experiences have been and where those lessons come from. So if you could just talk about some of the assignments you've had, some of the experiences you've had that, were formative to your career.
Yeah, sure. First of all, just the bumper sticker on terrorism is that it is still a thing.
Yeah.
So that's the summary version. But So I started my career in 2002, the summer of 2002, after the 9/11 attacks. And as we, as the United States government, were answering a lot of questions from the policy community around Iraq's use of and development of weapons of mass destruction. And importantly for me, as a brand new intelligence analyst in the counterterrorism unit for the Defense Intelligence Agency, the relationship between Saddam Hussein, his regime, and Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
And, it was interesting. I joined the intelligence community. I joined the Department of Defense to be part of the fight against Al-Qaeda, to figure out how we were going to help understand the world of terrorism in a way that could support policymakers as they pursued, a righteous campaign against Al-Qaeda. And my first job in the Defense Intelligence Agency was focused on these questions of Iraq That seemed like a bit of an aside.
Yeah.
And
same exactly felt that way to me too.
Right.
At the time, yeah.
I'm sure. And I mean, you had such a amazing perch to see it sort of live as the policymakers were discussing it. But the way I consumed it as, again, a brand new intelligence analyst was through the taskings that came from the Department of Defense, from OSD policy, from the Deputy Secretary's office, from the Secretary of Defense's office. And, for months, it was sort of relentless questions that all were around kind of explaining the relationship between Al-Qaeda and Saddam's regime, but like a new angle every time, because the question, we answered the question every time basically the same way.
Yeah.
That there's really no credible indication of a mature relationship or one that would, result in command and control. But every new intelligence report, regardless of the credibility, we would have to once again kind of spell out that analysis. And I go on at length about this because I didn't realize it at the time. But as I look back in my career, as I look back at sort of decisions that I made to pivot into the policy community, the way that I was a policymaker after having lived the life of an intelligence analyst, it was a pretty formative experience for me.
Yeah, I'm sure. Did you feel pressured, or was it more just the questions just kept coming?
So, look, I watched the senior analysts sort of deal with the pressure. There was definitely pressure in the organization because the fact that the questions kept coming, despite how many times you answered it in generally the same way, meant that they weren't getting the answer that they were looking for.
Yeah.
And seeing sort of that relentless push for some new angle, it was sort of felt by me as sort of low in the ranks as, a policy community looking for answers that they weren't getting from the intelligence community. And I will say that, watching my senior analysts deal with this incoming pressure with the kind of grace and objectivity and integrity to stay true to the best analysis that our intelligence collection allowed, that just showed me exactly what truth to power meant. It showed me exactly what that ethos of, informing the policymaker, whether or not they want to hear about it, the truth as best you can define it based on our sources of information.
Did you apply that experience, or did you think about that experience when you were at the White House in the Obama administration working on counterterrorism?
I hope I did. The job of a policymaker to consume intelligence is, to take it, maybe not at face value. You certainly have to dig into what an analyst provides or what a report says, but to sort of get the lay of the land as much as the intelligence community can describe it, and then figure out what your options are from there, right? Sometimes you've got to ask a lot of probing questions. Sometimes the way that the intelligence community is describing the world isn't exactly the sort of point that you were trying to get to as a policy customer. And so there's certainly a give and take that has to happen between a policymaker and the intelligence community, but you don't look for a different answer.
Yeah.
You don't shop around for the best answer that fits your bias policy direction.
Yeah.
What you have to do is you get the answer from the intelligence community, and then you accept the risk that it implies. If your policy outcome or your preferred policy preference, if the intelligence community shows you a piece of analysis that says, well, that's not a great idea, then as a policymaker, that doesn't mean you don't do it. I mean, maybe you still decide to do it, but you have to accept that you have heard that it's not a great idea.
Yeah.
And you have to be rational in thinking through, what do I need to do with this information to make it a better policy outcome?
Yeah. So I'm going to say something, but it's not a political statement. And what I'm going to say is that I worked for 6 presidents, 12, 13 administrations, and every single one of them but one, at some point in that administration, pressured the intelligence community in some way. And the one exception was the Obama administration. I never felt pressure in those 4 years, that first Obama administration that I, worked at the most senior levels in. I'd never felt pressure.
That's fascinating, actually. I wonder how much the history of how intelligence was consumed in prior administrations weighed on the Obama administration. I mean, you had people like John Brennan in the roles that, deeply understood the role of intelligence, but also its limitations,
yep.
and then could sort of navigate the policy arena in a way that sort of accepted what the IC provided, but then found the path that was needed as a result. So that's a really fascinating point, and I can see it having lived on the inside of that administration.
Yeah.
And just seeing how they valued the intelligence role in the policy process as sort of its own input into a larger decision-making scheme.
Yeah. Okay, so DIA post 9/11, then where does Christy go?
So DIA post 9/11, I spent a lot of time at DIA in the Joint Intelligence Task Force combating terrorism. That was my job when I was there through 2011. And what I loved about being at DIA was being at DIA at a time when the Department of Defense, the United States military, was in the midst of 2 land wars and where we owned the battle space. Yeah. And so the analysts that were working closely with the United States military, that got to deploy with the Joint Special Operations Command, that got to work with General Petraeus at the multinational headquarters in Iraq. I mean, that was the pointy end of the spear.
So you were deployed. You were deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Yeah. Not Afghanistan.
Iraq.
I deployed to the Middle East a couple of times in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Yeah, okay.
All in counterterrorism roles, and always sort of informing the operational decision making of the commanders on the ground. And it was an amazing experience. It made me as an intelligence analyst much more sensitive to the needs of operators, the people on the ground that need to get things done. What do they need to know today? Yeah. And as analysts, we spend a lot of time doing strategic intelligence analysis. We have tons of information in our brain about what is true about your account or the world. But when you deploy out forward, you've got to get very specific intelligence in a very timely way to people whose lives count on it.
Yeah.
And it was that sort of pointy end of the spear work that I really enjoyed about my tenure at DIA.
Yeah. So then in 2011, you go to the White House?
Yeah.
So how did that happen?
I don't know. You got to ask Nick Rasmussen. I still don't know how that happened. It was interesting. So it was around the time of the Arab Spring. It was just after bin Laden had been killed. And I went over to the counterterrorism directorate that Nick Rasmussen was running, that that rolled up to John Brennan. And what was fascinating at the time was that I started an account that didn't exist before I got there, which was actually a pretty important account. It was Iraq, Syria, the Middle East, European counterterrorism work. Some North Africa work split between me and another director. I didn't work Yemen. Yemen was its own full-time job, given our concerns about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula at the time. I didn't work the Gulf. That was sort of part of that other account. But that, like, the locus of what would eventually become the ISIS problem.
Yeah, you stepped right into the emergence of ISIS.
And it's interesting that we didn't have a counterterrorism lens on it. But that didn't mean we weren't working as an administration, right? I mean, the Iraq shop was quite large. And we thought of AQI as part of an overall insurgency problem. And for a lot of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, for a lot of reasons, that made a lot of sense. But as we thought about the post-2011 environment, what our relationship with the Iraqi counterterrorism service would look like, the Iraqi government would look like, it was clear, and Nick had the foresight to say, one, we've got to better understand what's going on the ground in the Middle East, especially at a time of dramatic change in the Middle East, and the Syrian opposition and the interest of terrorist groups really mattered then. But also, let's not forget about Iran, Hezbollah, and the Shia-related terrorist groups that before 9/11 had been the most significant terrorist threat to the United States.
Yeah. So then do you stay at the Obama White House until the end of the second administration, or do you go somewhere else?
No, I left about halfway through. So I stayed as a director of counterterrorism and then fleeted up to work for Lisa Monaco when she replaced John Brennan as the president's counterterrorism advisor. And worked in the West Wing with her during the early part of her tenure.
So you were in that office in the basement?
Oh, the one with the rats?
Yeah, the one with the rats and the low ceiling and, the bad air. No, I've been there.
Yeah. That one. That's the one. I will never forget that one. I lived there for, a year and a half. And I don't think any of us can forget what we called the cave. The glamour of the West Wing in the cave. So anyways, I did that with Lisa for a bit, and then went over to the Department of Defense and had my first role.
That's right.
At the Department of Defense as a non sort of CT person. It was Afghanistan. I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. But it was my first sort of regional policy role that wasn't sitting in the White House and wasn't focused in counterterrorism.
Yeah. So what does a Deputy Assistant Secretary, I've always wondered this, what does a Deputy Assistant Secretary do?
Everything.
They do the real work?
That's right. They do the real work. Nobody knows it. They toil away. They schlep up to the hill and explain policy, whether or not it has any rational explanation. No, I mean, the job, one, depends on the region that you're dealing with. For Afghanistan, we had policy oversight over how the United States government was spending over $5 billion a year in support of the Afghan National Defense Force. We spent time in the policy process, providing the Department of Defense perspective, working that with the Secretary of Defense and through the Secretary of Defense, so that we would position ourselves in a way that we thought would best serve the mission. We would go to the Hill and talk about and defend the policy decisions of the administration. I got to work very closely with the Inspector General for Afghanistan reconstruction. Right? You do a lot of work.
Yeah. I read all those reports whenever they came out. This was my best source of information, which is not saying a lot, but it's what happens when you're not in government anymore.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So then you go to the private sector, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I had a quick stint in Austin doing the Defense Innovation Unit for Secretary Carter and its expansion there. And then at the end of the Obama administration, I eventually transitioned to Dell Technologies, which is an Austin-based company. My family, we moved out to the Austin area, and I found myself in the middle of a company experience, a multinational global company that was navigating the world of geopolitics, of new tariff policies, of sort of a post-globalization mentality across the world that needed to think about risk differently. And so I had an opportunity to help shape how their supply chain thought about risk, resilience, sustainability, climate change, human rights.
And then you come back to the government as the head of the National Counterterrorism Center.
That's right.
A confirmed position, right? Senate confirmed position.
Yep.
And so you're running a large organization in the intelligence community. You're in the sit room all the time. You're on the Hill all the time. Talk about that experience just a little bit.
Yeah, the National Counterterrorism Center role is so unique in government. It's this organization that, yes, is part of the intelligence community, that's job is to be the primary integrator of all the United States government's counterterrorism and terrorism-related information. But it also, has this mandate of understanding U.S. government capabilities across the counterterrorism spectrum, whether our capabilities are up to the task of meeting the threat as we best understand it. And it's got an important role in sort of framing the discussion at deputies and principals and presidential level. And it's full of really amazing analysts.
It really is.
Really
is.
Good people, and who every day you get to be inspired by just walking in the door with.
Yeah. So I worked there for a very short time. I think you know that.
I remember.
Ran the analytic piece of it. And I love CIA analysts. I really do. But man, they are skeptical and cynical people. And I didn't feel that way at NCTC. I really didn't. It was a breath of fresh air.
Yeah. It's a really interesting place because actually relative to other counterterrorism shops, it's kind of small.
Yeah.
It punches above its weight. It's got this really important role in the policy process and at sort of a deputy's level of representation. But it's just, digging through mountains of information, trying to figure out what's going on. And the way that our analysts get after their work, whether it's on identity intelligence or watch and warning or kind of strategic analysis, it's really just amazing to see what they can accomplish.
Yeah. We are talking with Christy Abizaid. We'll be right back after a break. Stay with us.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
All right, so we want to take all of this, right, Christy, and we want to say, okay, what did you learn about, let's start with, the business of intelligence in general. How do you think about that?
Yeah.
What are the things that really stand out for you? There's probably, 50 of them, but what are the ones that really stand out?
Well, so, you and I had talked about doing this, and where to start is really hard. Both learning how to be an intelligence analyst and then transitioning as a policymaker that consumes that intelligence. I mean, I think I learned something different with every job that I had.
But one of the things that makes you unique, actually, there's a lot of things that make you unique, but one of the most important is that you've had both jobs in the intelligence community and policy jobs. So you've seen intelligence from both sides, and then you've had this experience, not in intelligence, but you've had an experience in the private sector, right, between government jobs, and that's really unique.
Yeah. I mean, but what's interesting is that for every one of those different positions that I had, like foundational to all of it was what I learned as an intelligence analyst, what I learned about the intelligence community, about what we already talked about with, about truth to power, about integrity and objectivity, and in how you consume so much information to build your own knowledge, but then when you're in the room, deliver what's most important to your audience so they can actually make a decision based on what you know. Yeah. Right? I mean, you know this well. I mean, you did it for 30 years. You led the organization and sat in those deputies meetings and understood the importance of being in the room, armed with the right information, and delivering it in a way that resonates.
Yeah. And
it's the difference between a good decision and a bad decision.
Yeah. In the room is really important, right? I think sometimes, when you're collecting intelligence or even doing intelligence analysis, you don't realize that people aren't sitting there waiting for these reports, right? They're going about their job of making policy, right? To make the country a better place or safer place, whatever it is. And they're not waiting for it. And you don't get these long papers, right? And, when you were in the White House, you don't get these long papers, right? And read every paragraph and read every sentence, right? So it really does come down to being in the room. That's where the impact is. You said something very important, and that is in a war zone, the pointy end of the spear is the war zone. But from a strategic intelligence perspective, the pointy end of the spear is in the sit room, right? That's where it all comes together in helping the president frame what's going on in the world so that he or she makes a better decision about how to protect the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, as an analyst, when you work hard on a product, right? You work hard on distilling all your information into the best page, maybe 3/4 of a page of analysis that delivers for the policymaker. So when they wake up and they read the PDB and they get that, they have that discussion with their PDB briefer, you think that sets the tone for all decision making. And no doubt there are PDBs that have made the difference in the course of the decision making of any administration. But having somebody like you come into a deputy's room and not just explain what that PDB said, but how the analysts were thinking about it when you were able to sit down and talk to them about it. The 3 questions they didn't address in the PDB because they didn't have space, but that is on the policymaker's mind because you're in the room with them all the time, right? Being able to have that discussion, not just what's on paper, not just what's in talking points, but that is thoughtful about the issues as the intelligence community understands it, and being able to iterate with the policymaker and help them understand what they need to know. I mean, that live interaction makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah. The other value of being in the room, besides doing all of that, is, and I'm sure this happened to you, it happened to me all the time, is their conversation. They wouldn't necessarily ask for something specific from us, but in their conversation, I saw the gaps in their knowledge. And I could go back and task my collectors and task my analysts, right, to do X, Y, or Z, because I just saw what they needed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things that I think I misunderstood about the policymaker until I was one was how much they don't need to care about the intelligence community and what it does, right? All they need to know is that, I want to task the IC a product and something will come back and I'll get the information I need. But they don't know that the IC has these sort of kind of strict ethos around informing but not influencing policy. They don't know that there are certain limitations to what the intelligence community collection apparatus can provide and in what sort of level of timeliness like that. And frankly, it's not their job to know that.
Right, exactly.
So having you in the room or me in the room or, those of us surrounded by the policymaker and knowing what they need, even if they don't know how to ask for it, it's a really important role for all of us to be able to play.
Yeah. Okay, what about intelligence analysis?
Well, wait, sorry, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay.
Notice how the interview has switched.
I know I've been very excited for this reason. So, okay, you were President Bush's briefer. You were the deputy and acting director of CIA during the Obama administration. You were the head of the DA. I think I have that right.
Mm-hmm.
You know the policy customer because you've been in the room with the policy customer. What do you think about this line between policy and intelligence, and we are taught as the intelligence community that's a bright line, you do not cross it. But to know your customer is how you serve your customer. How have you navigated that?
Well, I think so you have to answer the question when I'm done answering the question. But this is a really important question. So I navigated it until a senior policymaker didn't want me to navigate it anymore. In other words, I wouldn't go in with the intent of offering a policy view. But if the president said, Michael, what do you think we should do about this? You switch gears and you answer the question. And, you do the best you can. And, you and I both know that actually making policy is a heck of a lot harder than doing intelligence, and doing intelligence is really hard. That's why these people who write, 800-word op-eds about what we should do about Ukraine or Gaza, right? It's a lot harder than that, right? It's a lot harder than that.
Right.
So that's the way I navigated it. But Christy, I also had an experience serving overseas where I was deeply embedded in the intelligence analysis process of another country. And they did not have a bright red line. In fact, they had policymakers involved in signing off on the analysis that went to the senior leadership. And I was skeptical of that when I first saw it. But I actually walked away admiring it because, three things. Number one, I thought it was more relevant. I thought the analysis ended up being more relevant because a lot of times we'd be talking about, answering a particular question, and the policymakers there would say, that's not the question we have. We actually have a different question. So I thought the analysis ended up being more relevant. And then number two, because they were involved in the conversation about what the analysis should be, they owned it too. Yeah. So they couldn't later in a sit room kind of situation say, well, that's what the intelligence community thinks, but I think something different. They couldn't do that. They were boxed in because they helped put it together. And then number three, and I saw this too, they could never say I was never warned, right? Because they were in the room for all these discussions. So I thought it was incredibly valuable in tying intelligence to policy. Did it mean you had to pay a little bit more attention and mitigate the risks of politicization? Sure. But at the end of the day, you got to mitigate something, right? Do you mitigate being relevant or do you mitigate the risk of politicization?
Oh, that's fascinating.
What do you think?
That's fascinating.
As I try to turn this back to me interviewing you.
Well, so just in the very tactical sense, because there's never a policy or operational setting where you're laying out the intelligence case and somebody doesn't just ask you, well, what do you think? Mm-hmm. What would you, right? I mean, and you don't want the GS-12 or GS-8 analysts to have to be put in that position, but as a leader, you have to deal with it. And so I think the way that I always would do it was to say, well, look, the analysis says this, taking off my sort of intelligence hat, here's how I would think about it. And I would try and be really clear that this is not the intelligence community's view on your policy, but if I were to opine in my personal capacity or, case of NCTC, put my policy hat on, which I actually wear every once in a while, then I would find a way to express that view. There were also a number of times when you would present an analytic viewpoint from the intelligence community that just didn't sound right to you as a leader, right? That you would say, look, this is what the analysts think. Here's their argumentation. It's a close call. They only have medium confidence anyways. And then the question is, do you say what you think if you don't totally agree with it? Mm-hmm. And if you do that, and I think that actually you owe it as a leader and as a strategic advisor to the policy community to be able to do that, you just have to be really clear about when that's your view and when it's the IC's view. And I saw you do that in a number of settings when I was in the Obama administration. I always thought you handled it really well.
Thanks.
But the other thing I would say is just on this intelligence policy, intelligence operations relationship, it was completely foreign to the private sector. And even having worked in policy before I went to private sector, I tried to sort of play this role of bringing intelligence processes into their decision-making world. And And I would want to just tell them, hey, this new regulatory regime is coming and this is the implications for the business. And I always would want to stop there, and they never let me.
Right.
And they shouldn't have.
Right. What should we do about it? Yeah. In the private sector and in running an organization like NCTC, if somebody brings you a problem, you want them to bring a solution too. So why should the sit room be any different? Right? From their perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is always interesting watching new sort of policy principles that haven't spent a lot of time in government try and absorb why the government does this sort of intel policy divide this way. It seems a little bit crazy.
Yeah. Okay. Intelligence analysis. Give me one or two things.
Okay.
Yeah. Christy lessons.
So, as an analyst, never go into a briefing stuck on your talking points or without an ability to pivot deeper and in directions that you never anticipated your customer.
Yeah.
You walk into these discussions with customers, knowing more than they know. Don't be so intimidated by the setting that you can't go where they need to go to help them make decisions. And I saw way too many times as a leader, but also as an analyst across my cohort, just people kind of hewing so closely to their script that they weren't agile enough to be useful in the policy operational context.
Yeah. And the real value of a briefing from a policymaker's perspective, you tell me, right? Because I was never one, but I think the real value is you get to ask the questions.
Absolutely.
Right? You get to frame the questions you want answers to. And if they keep on going back to their talking points, then they're not helping you do that.
Absolutely. I was actually a little bit brutal about this as NCTC director when, we would have these great sessions. My favorite time at NCTC was being able to sit down with the analysts and understand the key threats around the world. And when analysts would come in there with 4 pieces of paper with talking points and they would start reading from them, I would say, okay, now it's time to ask some questions. And immediately just to get them to understand that this is an interaction.
Yeah.
This is not a one-way sort of receive mode.
Yeah. Here's the other thing I'd say about briefings, is that the way we teach people to brief is not the way a human being actually tells a story, right? I never briefed any president the way that Kent School at CIA teaches people to brief.
It's so true.
It's so awkward.
It's so awkward, right? And actually, in the military, they like the very clear boundary lines. But when my first couple of meetings at the White House, where I would prepare so much to be able to go in this room and have whatever conversation we were going to have, I was always shocked that it was just a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It was conversation between really smart people who were trying to work through a problem.
Right.
And that's what a briefing is, right?
Right.
That's what it is. That's when it's most valuable.
Yeah. What else on intelligence analysis? One more.
So I found when I was working Afghanistan from a policy perspective that I see the divide between the Department of Defense and the intelligence community about the future of Afghanistan and the future capability of the Afghan force was an impossible conversation to maneuver through.
Yeah.
And part of this was because, typically the intelligence community does analysis on the adversary or on sort of a third party, and they're not making judgments about the policy or the operation that you've put together. But when you're doing analysis on an organization that exists because of support from the United States military, that succeeds or fails or grows or doesn't based on the investment that the United States military is putting into it, it just creates this dynamic where, the United States military feels judged by the intelligence community about the direction and the capability of the Afghan force. And, watching analysts hold their line, watching analysts be able to explain in detail why they judged what they judged, despite significant pressure, including from very senior U.S. military or Defense Department officials, and to see them do that day in and day out, I thought was really impressive. And so, we talked about objectivity and integrity. And when I look at sort of how that impacted, and to be honest, I don't know that it ended up being helpful to the policy process, but seeing the importance of that analytic integrity at play in such a fraught debate around Afghanistan, I was always really impressed by.
And that's really hard. It is really hard to navigate.
Yeah.
There's no easy rules to apply to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. One of the things I found that helped in that kind of situation was to say, just because I'm saying something doesn't mean I like saying it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that softens it a little bit. What about leadership of an intelligence enterprise? You've now run, a pretty large one.
Yeah.
You said it was small earlier. It's not that small. What's your sense?
So first of all, and this is especially true in the counterterrorism field that both you and I spent so much time in, leading in crisis is an absolute essential skill for any U.S. government national security leader. And because one, your job is to manage through crisis all the time. But two, make sure that your organization is in a position to perform in the midst of crisis. And some of that is about how you absorb the moment, about, taking the pressure off the team, making sure that the chaos that's coming at you doesn't get reflected down in the ranks as much as you can possibly help them avoid it. And, clearing roadblocks so they can do the work that they need to do.
Yeah.
And, some leaders have a really hard time with this. Some leaders sort of feel the pressure and amplify it down. And you just don't have that luxury in a time of crisis and chaos.
Yeah. When I learned this point, I was George Tenet's executive assistant, was the East Africa bombings. And I think that happened on a Friday. And on Sunday night at 9:00, he had to brief President Clinton on what we knew. And by that time, we knew that this was an al-Qaeda operation that tied all the way back to bin Laden in Afghanistan. And the analysts in CTC at CIA were writing these talking points, and it was 8:30 and they weren't there. It was 8:40 and they weren't there. And I'm freaking. And I said to him, I'm going to call down there. And he said, no. He said, Michael, in a crisis situation, everybody is working as hard as they can. You don't need to kick somebody in the rear in a crisis. You need to kick them in the rear, when nothing's happening. And I learned that from him, and I applied that forever afterwards. And it's 100% right. What you said is 100% right.
Oh, that's, it's funny too, because in those kinds of roles, those chief of staff roles, you really, you're the absorption point more so than the principal.
Right. If that piece of paper didn't show up, he would yell at me, not them.
Exactly. And you just got to be willing to accept it.
Exactly. Right? That's the job. You said something else that's super important, I think, which is you're responsible. As a leader, you're responsible for making sure your organization is ready for a crisis. And that is absolutely true. And this is something that analysts don't understand either, that a lot of what you ask them to do in normal times, in writing this paper or that paper, is to develop their expertise so that when a crisis does happen, they are ready to rock and roll.
Absolutely. Yeah, how you lead when things are going well, right? The pressure you put your team under when, all things are normal, that is about making sure that they're ready to step up to the plate when you don't have time to teach them to do it.
Yeah.
Right? And, I always thought about my job at NCTC as setting high expectations, because we will inevitably be in another moment of crisis, and we will just need to perform.
Yep.
And I was amazed every day by the team's ability to exceed my expectations, even when they were high. And I just watching them navigate multiple crises, whether it was the withdrawal from Afghanistan or, making sure we had the right analytic perspective in advance of HVT operations, or managing a pretty significant change in the threat environment after October 7th, and in some specific ways here in the United States homeland over the last year, they nailed it every time.
Yeah.
They nailed it every time. But, that doesn't mean that I didn't lose my mind when we didn't nail it when we didn't have to.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, we could go on and on and on and on. I'm sure of that. And what we should do at some point is either at the Mike Hayden Center at George Mason University or at the Bush School at Texas A&M, we should continue this conversation, because there's a lot more lessons that you and I have talked about and shared with each other. So I think, we should do this someplace else too, then in a way that it benefits the next generation.
Well, it is always fun to be able to just talk with you. So anytime you want to do it, I am up for it. And thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me. That was Christy Abizaid. I'm Michael Morell. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.